Every single grand strategy game, going back to Civilization 1, has had a significant and fundamental problem in their game design. All the major companies building these games know of this problem, but I think that their attempted solutions are just going to make it worse, as they have been making it worse for about the last 10 years. And this video is about why. So, firstly, I bet you're imagining, questioning, what is this problem? Um, if you've played a lot of strategy games, you might have an idea. That problem is the end game. As in everything after about the middle point of the game, when you finally have a position that's relatively strong, is extremely boring, routine, chore-like, and predictable and uninteresting, among other things. I'm going to quickly cover some of the reasons why this is an issue. One of the main reasons is that by the time most players have reached the end game, they have pretty much already won the game. The game just hasn't realized that yet. Any individual AI can't really stand up to the player, and the AIs together won't work together to stand up to the player, so the game becomes a trivial cakewalk with a difficulty curve that is not ideal. Usually in a game, the difficulty curve goes like this. You might say in a grand strategy game, difficulty curve goes like this. So it goes down, which is kind of like the fundamental problem with the roguelite genre. And it's a problem that has plagued every single game in this genre because it's fundamental to the genre. Another reason why the late game is trivial is because usually the only reason why the AI is at all difficult is because it has more stuff than you do. As a game goes on, the player will, through good play, uh, get they will narrow the resource gap between them and the AI, meaning that they are now on equal footing with an AI that is much stupider than they are. And usually this good play will outpace even AI that scales in its buffs. So the AI's only challenge vanishes in the late game, which makes it trivial, which makes it not fun. Thirdly, there is the issue of the late game of most strategy games having an awful lot of this manual inputs, clicking. Um, you are often battling as much against carpal tunnel syndrome as you are against the AI opponents, because as a strategy game goes on, the player gets more stuff, and strategy games are all about giving orders to your stuff. And so, if you have a lot of stuff, you need to give it a lot of orders every single turn. And this is not ideal for one's sanity or enjoyment. One of the main reasons why, for example, even though I love the game Age of Wonders 3, I've never finished or even gotten close to finishing a campaign, and that is because once I start building enough cities, and I then have to build enough units, and all these units, I have to command all those armies, and that is just a chore. And even if I've pretty much already won it, even if I'm waging a grand epic war, the grandness and epicness of it is constantly undermined by the fact that I am manually commanding every single little thing around. And it's not like these games can give the player an AI delegation tool, not that they have done this, because the AI in this game sucks anyway, so the player probably would not trust their stuff to the AI. You see this in games like Stellaris, where you have to manage a lot of planets. You see this in games like Civ, especially the earlier games, where you have to manage a lot of cities. You see this in games like Age of Wonders, where you have to manage a lot of everything. You see this in games like Total War, where every single turn you get bombarded with 50 notifications that you need to level up this agent, level up this general, go research this technology. And even if you manage to get through all those notifications, you also have the fact that you have about 50 provinces and you need to go and upgrade every single building that you can upgrade with your now massive treasury. And you also need to build all the buildings in the newly conquered things. And also, if that wasn't fun enough, you have to order around all the armies you have. And with every single agent you upgrade, level up, or general, mind you, you have to make a decision. Which path do I go down? I wish there was an auto allocate button because these games are about making decisions, so you get fatigued by making decisions, and you have to make so many decisions in a Total War game in the later turns. It is seriously unfun. I wish that my agents got passively stronger, just down an optimal path without me having to go and try to remember what the optimal thing to do is. It is bad. It is not good. I want to be the emperor, giving commands to my kingdom rather than be some white collar worker manually making a bunch of low level decisions. That is not my historical fantasy enjoyment. And I doubt it is yours, unless you have been Stockholm syndromed into liking the spreadsheet simulators that some of these games are. Which all power to you if you are, because then you can actually really enjoy some of the modern grand strategy games, rather than being frustrated at every single one of their aspects. Okay. The fundamental problem there is that the way you interact with the game itself becomes a barrier to you reaching the late game. Even if the AI was perfect and the late game challenge were optimal, it still isn't fun. And so people rarely do play the late game. A corollary of this is that you never really get to play with your end game toys. If the game lets you get more advanced units or buildings as the game goes on, which, if it's following design principles, it should give you more stuff to do as the game goes on, more choices to make. Then, because the end game and even sometimes middle game, late middle game, isn't a challenge, you'll never really get the chance to play with those tools that are available to you. In the Total War campaign, you'll very rarely. Sometimes campaigns will be over before you get access to your tier 5 units, for example, in Total War Warhammer. Finally, because the late game is so poor and sometimes even the mid game, this this leads to the early game becoming worse because players play the early game so much that they quickly optimize it. And find out their ideal strategy that they just perform on memory each time, and it becomes dull playing the same starting positions again and again and again. I imagine the problem of the early game being optimized out of fun is something that happens a bit more in something like Crusader Kings or especially Total War, because the starting positions for a given faction are always the same. But I imagine that in games like Stellaris, this can happen as well. Once you have all the events memorized, once you have the general dance of the early game down, you're just performing that dance and waiting for you to reach mid game so that you can actually get some ships and do some conquering or do whatever it is that you want to do on your run. So this is why in these games the late game has always been pretty poor. This is in every single grand strategy game that's ever existed. So why are we making this worse? Well, the late game suffers for the reasons that we've described, and honestly, the reason behind the reasons for a lot of those is that the AI is poor. Notice that any of these games, whether it's Stellaris or Total War or Civ, they get far more competitive when it is human players playing against each other compared to AI players. You might even have a compelling and epic late game if it is human players playing against humans rather than human against AIs. This is important because it means that a poor endgame is not by the fundamental design of these games, but rather largely due to design of their opponents that they give you. So why has this been getting worse, and what has been done to make it worse? Well, what a lot of recent strategy game releases, and especially the many, many DLCs, have been doing is adding new mechanics. And this completely wrecks the endgame problem for a variety of reasons. One clear reason is that more stuff that the player can do is more stuff that the AI must consider. If you think about it, an AI that struggles to decide optimally between 5 actions will struggle even worse when it is given 10 actions to consider. And yet, game developers are incentivized to add more mechanics and especially more powerful ones with every single DLC because that is how these studios make their money. Now, I have nothing against that. The issue is that these incentives are prioritizing short-term fixes, which don't actually fix the problem, and in the long run make the games worse. Another issue with adding new mechanics is that these mechanics are usually powerful, and even if they aren't, it's yet more ways for the player to get a strength advantage over the AI quickly by using the mechanics available to them. And the AI is only challenging when it has a strength advantage over you, And so anything that the player can use to more quickly get more powerful than the AI, when the AI is poor, leads to a trivial game, and a trivial game is the end game problem. So we're making the AI worse by giving it yet more choices that it has not been built to handle, and we are also giving the player the ability to make the mundane monotony of the end game happen even sooner. It's difficult to perhaps justify investing significantly in the AI when you can't really sell a DLC for, hey, we fixed the fundamental problem of our game. It's a good long-term decision, I believe, but you get faster and more certain rewards by adding new types of factions, adding new mechanics for factions, adding more bloat, which is why so many strategy games are the pretty much opposite of elegance, even if they can be fun. Furthermore, adding more mechanics makes the other great problem of strategy games worse, and the other problem is tutorials. As a recent example, I bought the new Crusader Kings 3 DLC, All Under Heaven, and I was excited to go play as a feudal lord in Japan. Imagine my frustration when I, tired on a Sunday, go and hover over the new government form and see that practically with all the new mechanics there, it's basically a whole other game. One should not require a PhD in paradoxology to enjoy a little feudal conquest. And with every single DLC adding yet more mechanics, it is essentially a way to distract from the problem of the late game not being challenging by adding more flashy things to the screen and more shallow things to try out rather than adding anything with actual depth that takes a while to explore. And depth does not mean more mechanics to learn because a bunch of shallow mechanics is still shallow. We have a term for that. It's called a mile wide and inch deep. Depth is where the mechanics play together and work together in a way that produces an interesting metagame that perhaps does not even have an optimal solution and requires a lot of exploration to get a handle on, but can still get grasped decently, pretty quickly by anyone. So, an example of this is fighting games. You can perform decently-ish just by button mashing in these games, and you're gonna have a fun time. But you can also go extremely deep, memorize all the combos, and practice and practice and practice, and you can get really, really good at fighting games. Another example is chess. It's very easy to learn the rules of chess, but the metagame there is exceptionally, exceptionally complex. This whole area of research. The reason why is because chess has depth with simple rules. Fighting games have depth with simple rules. You don't need five different resource types, 50 different faction types, and a bunch of new overpowered mechanics being added with every DLC to make fighting games interesting. They're interesting because they're deep. And strategy games, ironically, often lack that depth, especially when you take the DLCs into account. So, what is the alternative? Well, if games have been getting worse, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people in these communities, sometimes who have to put up with broken AIs for months at a time, if the problem has been more complex, bloated mechanics and poor AI, perhaps we might find a solution in more elegant mechanics with better AI. And indeed, it is easier to produce a good AI for a game that has simpler mechanics. When I suggest simple mechanics, a part of you might quease up at that thought. And the reason is because we've come to associate complex mechanics with realism. And realism is why a lot of these games, like Total War, the Paradox titles, are enjoyable because they feed into the role play. They make you feel like you're commanding an army or that you're leading a nation or a royal family. But it isn't really about realism so much as it is about believability. We want the ability to suspend a disbelief and to actually immerse ourselves in the world we're playing. Complex mechanics that try to as accurately emulate the historical reality as possible are one way to do that. But people are able to immerse themselves and have great Roman adventures in Rome Total War, and Rome Total War has like half of its factions are anachronistic. Bronze Age Egypt fighting Rome when it should be Ptolemaic. So it doesn't need to be realistic to be believable. Gabe Newell has some good thoughts on the matter of it's not about realism, it's about entertainment. Um, Believability is part of the role play that makes these historical strategy games so interesting, and for that you need believability, not necessarily complexity. Complexity, in fact, makes it worse because the poor AI makes it feel like you're fighting a stupid AI and constantly breaks your immersion because, like, oh, look, the AI is doing something stupid again. Whereas if the mechanics were simpler and you had a better AI, but the mechanics are still believable, you could still get much more immersed and retain that immersion for far longer rather than you starting to optimize the fun out of everything because you're like, oh, the AI is doing something stupid again. What wonderful historically accurate mechanics I have. Shame that the AI is a toddler. Finally, I think that studios ought to take a longer term perspective when dealing with their games. Particularly, they have a model centered around repeatedly monetizing the same audience with DLC, so it makes sense to do a long-term investment by making the AI better rather than just adding a fresh coat of paint, cheap paint at that, every time it starts to chip. As a final example, chess and Go have AIs that people who play these games for their entire lives call beautiful. And yet, no one playing strategy games expects to be calling Total War's AI beautiful or Europa Universalis' AI beautiful in its play anytime soon. That's almost comical. Perhaps we ought to change the direction we are developing these games with. And that's my thesis in this video. I myself professionally work with AI and am exploring making some games that go in what I believe to be the right direction. So please subscribe and such. Other than that, that's all for today. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time, or possibly in one of the recommended videos. Have a good one.